In today's episode of Today in World War II, January 22nd, Finland announces the formation of a new foreign legion that included British volunteers. The Japanese attempt to flank MacArthur's defense line in Bataan ended in disaster. Speaking of MacArthur, he was forced to abandon his main defense line and move it back about 5 miles due to Japanese pressure. The Soviets started evacuating civilians from Leningrad over their newly completed ice road over Lake Ladoga. The Americans and the Australian forces on Papua New Guinea announced the end of all Japanese resistance in that part of New Guinea. And American journalist, photographer Margaret Bourk-White becomes the very first woman to fly a combat mission with the United States Air Force. The Soviets begin their final drive to take Stalingrad, and 36,000 troops land in Anzio, Italy, with very little trouble, but not yet. Let's get started. Okay, so on January 22nd, 1940, the Finns were already gratefully using the help of Swedish and Norwegian volunteers to help them fight off the Soviet Union's unprovoked and belligerent attack against them. Well, they announced publicly that they had officially formed a foreign legion for all the foreign volunteers to fight against the Soviets, and they announced this would include British volunteers. Um, that's all well and good, and a few volunteers did trickle in, but I can tell you that there weren't that many Brits that made it to Finland before the war ended. Just to keep in mind, the clock was ticking here. Remember that it was right around the 1st of December when the Soviets attacked. The war was over on the first week of March. So it's about more or less around 95 days the war lasted. We're at January 22nd here. So you're talking maybe 5 weeks to go. I think we're going to file that in the filing cabinet of too little too late. Okay. But it's never too late, nor is it too little for you to subscribe to my channel. It's just the simplest thing in the world. Just click the subscribe button. There's a bell so you get notified by YouTube whenever I drop a video. I mean, it's the easiest thing to do, right? So just do it. Become a subscriber. Be my buddy. Okay? All right, on January 22nd, 1942, in the Philippines, we're still talking about the Bataan defense line. MacArthur has gathered all of his troops, all of his supplies, munitions, so on and so forth. Their plan is to hold out on this very concentrated, very difficult terrain to be able to hold out the Japanese as long as they could. Japanese, in previous videos here I've done recently, when I was describing the Japanese advance from Malaysia or Malaya down to take Singapore, I told you that one time they were very successful in putting all their troops and their equipment on, artillery, tanks, and so forth on rafts that they built out of the jungle wood, and they floated past the Brits' defense line, and then they were able to flank them that way. And they took a lot of casualties, okay? I'm not, but the Japanese didn't seem to care about that. They tried a similar attack this time on this date. They used fishing boats, and they were trying to get around the main defense line and land behind their lines and flank them that way. Well, it didn't work at all. Whereas the Brits were forced to pull back, and in a panic, the Americans and the Army, the Marines, and the Filipinos did not panic, and they had anti-aircraft guns, and they chopped up those fishing boats and stopped them in their tracks. Now, on the same date, January 22nd, 1942, MacArthur did order the Abuke-Maban defense line to be abandoned, and he wanted to pull back and consolidate their new defense line about 5 miles back from the main defense line. It was not because of this flanking attempt by the Japanese. I believe it was yesterday's video or the day before, I did talk about the fact that Japanese did penetrate that line, and so they were probably going to be forced to withdraw anyway. But it just goes to show you how they were really desperately trying to end this resistance in the Philippines. General Hama, he was the Japanese general of the army trying to pacify and destroy all resistance in the Philippines. He was getting a lot of rockets up his butt by the high command because it was taking so long to conquer the Philippines. They were going through the rest of the territories like poop through a goose, and yet Philippines was the one that was the hard nut to crack, and so he was getting a lot of pressure to this. So they was, of course, he was putting the pressure on the troops to do the same thing. So yeah, that was what's going on there. So um, but, I know that Hama did not like all of that pressure coming from the Japanese high command. But I don't want you to think that I'm putting pressure on you to like my video and leave a comment. I'm not the Japanese high command, okay? I'm not your enemy. I'm your friend. So do me a favor. Click the like button, leave a comment, and do me a solid, okay? Thank you. On today's date, on January 22nd, 1942, the Soviets commenced a massive evacuation of civilians from Leningrad, which has been under siege since 1941. They were able to do so because their military position was strengthened. The Germans were not as strong because the main thrust of their of their offensive in 42 was in the southern part of Russia, Soviet Union, and so taking advantage of the fact that the Lake Ladoga ice lake had frozen over, it was now able to take trucks, and so they were able to establish a corridor temporarily enough to get to start taking some civilians out. By April, they were able to get about 440,000 civilians out of Leningrad. So, boy, the ones that were able to get out, that was like winning a lottery ticket. Just goes to show you just how badly they suffered during that siege. And on January 22nd, 1943, the American Australian troops in Papua New Guinea were announced that they had ended all Japanese resistance in that part of New Guinea. And it was the first Japanese land defeat of World War II. Now, they had been defeated on Guadalcanal Island, but New Guinea is a huge island, okay? And it's divided up in half. You've got Papua New Guinea, the side, if you look at New Guinea on a map, it kind of looks like a turkey. Okay. So Buna, the Papua New Guinea that the Australians controlled, that's more like the head of the turkey. So that's where this fighting was going on. And it was a slog. It was a slog. And boy, that was some of the worst conditions anyone fought in World War II. And I tell you what, the Aussies, I mean, the Americans helped, but it was an Aussie campaign for the most part. And boy, they deserve all the credit in the world for defeating the Japanese in those horrible conditions. So now the thrust was going to be MacArthur was going to move up New Guinea all the way into the Philippines. That was the southwest thrust. Nimitz was going to do the Central Pacific thrust by going island hopping, and that's how the offensive was going to be from 43 on until the war ended. On January 22nd, 1943, very famous photojournalist Margaret Bourk-White, uh, brave lady, she became the first woman to fly on a United States Air Force combat mission with the 8th Air Force over Germany on a bombing mission. I tell you what, I mean, you didn't know. I mean, this was before they were getting fighter escort there and back, and so you were taking a huge chance by taking a B-17 or a B-24 over on a bombing mission unescorted. I don't know if I would have had the bravery to do that. Kudos to her for showing that she had some cojones, to do that. And that was, I think, a noteworthy footnote in history. Okay, so that you can put that in your World War II Trivial Pursuit bag whenever I come out with that. Okay, in January 22nd, 1943, the Soviets began their final drive in Stalingrad to rid the Sixth Army of its presence, and announcing their presence with authority, if you know what I mean. By this time, the those troops were like scarecrows, barely hanging on, being told to fight to the death. And the weather was just horrible, cold. They were not getting supplied enough. The wounded were not being able to be evacuated. The Soviets had been taking more and more airfields that the Luftwaffe was using in their amateuristic attempt to airlift supplies to the besieged German soldiers. And look, as a human being, I don't like human suffering at all. But under the circumstances, if there's anyone who deserved that kind of fate, it was those soldiers, and how they behaved in the Eastern Front. And listen, Soviets were no prize either. Okay, I'm not excusing them. The war in Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Front was barbaric. Neither side followed the Geneva Convention, and with a few exceptions. Generally speaking, the Germans followed the Geneva Convention against the Western Allies, although, of course, there's exceptions, and I document those in this series. But I'd much rather be an American or a British or Canadian or Polish soldier in Western Europe and getting captured than German soldier or a Russian soldier on the Eastern Front because it was just barbaric. On January 22nd, 1944, General Mark Clark, the head of the Allied forces in Italy, he decided that he was tired of beating his head against the Gustav line that General Kesselring had set up in the Italian peninsula. So he wanted to try to flank them. And so he landed 36,000 Allied troops at Anzio. And initially, he faced very little opposition. The Anzio invasion was a textbook example of opportunities lost due to timidity on behalf of the American generals because they had very little opposition. It caught the Germans by surprise. And if they had acted aggressively, if they had poured their forces and their supplies, their tanks and so forth into the bridgehead and moved quickly, I mean, the road to Rome was completely open. I'm not saying he should have gone to Rome, but he certainly could have acted forcibly and done what the plan called for, which would be bold offensive action and to try to flank the Custer line and go and turn back towards it and attack the Germans from the back end. Well, that didn't happen. He invaded and then waited, and he just gave Kesselring enough time to pull forces from the Gustav line and bring forces from northern Italy in, and then they were in for months and months and months of hell, and they almost got pushed back into the sea. So, not the best day for American leadership, military leadership. I hate to say that. And then finally, on January 22nd, 1945, the remnants of the beaten, uh, broke down German Fourth Panzer Army. They were able to get out of a Soviet pocket and they were able to flee to the Oder River in eastern Germany. But let's face it, on January 22nd, 1945, that was, I don't know, it was not exactly Nirvana, if you know what I mean, because let's look at the math again, okay? The war ended at the end of April. So now you got February, October. You got about 3 months to go for the war ended. They're already being pushed into Eastern Germany. Soviets are bringing the Ukrainian front, the Belarusian front, the Baltic front. They're all combining together. They're all going to meet at Berlin. And, the Fourth Panzer Army had a lot of things to go through yet before the war was over. Let's just put it that way, okay? But I want to thank you very much for watching this video. I appreciate your support.